It's Dr. Paul Fiddes, who is one of this year's featured speakers at the Baylor Symposium on Faith and Culture. Professor Fiddes is a professor of systematic theology at the University of Oxford, and until 2007, and for nearly 20 years, he served also as the principal of Regent's Park College at Oxford. Dr. Fiddes is a world-renowned theologian whose knowledge and expertise run deep and wide across a variety of subjects in theology, history, and literature. Among his many books and articles, I might mention several that have been particularly influential in helping us think more deeply about what it means to be Christian in the contemporary world: The Created Suffering of God, The Promised End, Eschatology and Theology and Literature, and Participating in God, a Pastoral Doctrine of the Trinity. We look forward, God willing, in the next several years to seeing several more important volumes from his pen, tentatively entitled Seeing the World and Knowing God, Ancient Wisdom and a Postmodern World, Shakespeare and Divine Love, Theology in Shakespeare's Comedy, and a commentary on Romans in the Blackwell Bible Commentary series. Finally, I would be remiss not to mention also the very able leadership that Dr. Fiddes has rendered to the Baptist World Alliance in its various theological discussions with other religious communities. I am personally especially grateful for his role in formulating a thoughtful, and in my opinion, indeed, even profound response from the BWA to the well-known letter put out by Muslim leaders and scholars to various Christian and Jewish groups, inviting conversation over matters of common concern and dialogue over those that divide us. Dr. Fiddes' paper today is entitled Not Anarchy but Covenant, a response to Matthew Arnold's view of the cultural Philistinism of nonconformist Christianity. Would you join me in welcoming Professor Fiddes to Baylor?
Thank you. Here are some lines from Matthew Arnold's poem, Dover Beach, written as he stood on the shore at night, listening to the tide going out in the darkness. The sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. Ah, love, let us be true to one another. For the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. In Arnold's reflection, it's not just the tide that's receding, it's Christian faith retreating before the onset of a new age whose tide he sees is coming in. Written in 1851, the poem detects the growing secular mood, not just among intellectuals, but among the mass of people in Western Europe. In particular, Arnold discerned a widespread rejection of the Bible that he treasured as the highest poetic expression of the moral and spiritual aspirations of the human race. It may seem extraordinary that in the face of this crisis, he turns in his prose works to launch an attack on the nonconformist churches of his time, condemning them as cultural Philistines. Surely, one might think, given the situation, he would have better targets than the Baptists, Methodists, Congregationalists, and Presbyterians in England. But while he subjects them to a devastating critique, he's paying them the compliment of believing that they matter in the great conflict between faith and unbelief that is coming. As the backbone of the middle class, which was the powerful player in the industrial and commercial world of the time, they had great influence on the situation. If only, thought Arnold, they could be changed and renewed, if above all they could become more cultured, then something might be done to stop the tide of the sea of faith running out. This is a fascinating social commentary on Christian faith, at a time when it seemed to many observers that religion was going to be shortly swept away by the tide of secularization, stemming largely from the new scientific revolution. In this paper, I want to explore Matthew Arnold's critique of the Nonconformists, to see why he thought that their beliefs and church life were so impoverished, and why he considered that they were actually encouraging the move to secularism. I want to affirm some of the truths he discerns, but also to expose some defects in his arguments. I'm a constructive theologian rather than a historian, so I want to make an alternative proposal about the way that we might respond to the challenge of our secular culture today. How shall we encourage an intellectual revival of faith, which Arnold would perhaps be surprised to find has not yet been entirely swept away by the secular tide? We might, of course, be inclined to dismiss Matthew Arnold's attack on nonconformity as coming from a prejudiced quarter. He was not only a member of the Church of England, but son of the famous Thomas Arnold, headmaster of the quintessentially Anglican rugby school, and he was himself professor of poetry at Oxford for 10 years, in a university where students were required to sign the 39 Articles of the Church of England. But Matthew Arnold was, for the whole of his professional life, a government inspector of schools, that is, junior and high schools, and the schools he inspected were all supported and sometimes run by nonconformists. So, travelling up and down the country, he came to know English nonconformity well, or at least he thought he knew it well. Look, he exclaims in his book, Culture and Anarchy, look at the life imaged in such a newspaper as the Nonconformist. A life of jealousy of the establishment, disputes, tea meetings, openings of chapels, sermons. With this narrow cultural life, he compares his great love, Oxford, writing, steeped in sentiment as she lies, spreading her gardens to the moonlight, and whispering from her towers the last enchantments of the Middle Age. Who will deny that Oxford, by her ineffable charm, keeps ever calling us nearer to the true goal of all of us, to the ideal, to perfection? Oxford, for Arnold, is the symbol and focus of culture and stands over against the grey life of those whom he condemns as cultural Philistines, the newly enriched middle classes of his day. Among these, the nonconformists, or members of the free churches, including the Baptists, are his chief target, and singled out for a special attack is the Baptist Charles Spurgeon, whose vast tabernacle had recently been raised in the Elephant and Castle region of London in order to accommodate the congregation of thousands who flocked to hear him preach. Now, the nonconformist tea meeting, or even the functional structure of a nonconformist tabernacle, is bound to come off badly when compared to the spires of Oxford. But we shouldn't forget that all nonconformists, including Baptists, had been excluded from the universities of Oxford and Cambridge since 1662, and was still excluded when Arnold was writing. We may well feel that Arnold is deeply unfair in his account of the chapel ethos, especially in view of the story of the intellectual life of primitive Methodists that David Beddington told us about last evening. Arnold has a large blind spot here, but I ask for your patience. I believe that if we persist with the reasons why Arnold, in his own mind, condemned the nonconformists, we shall find some illumination on the theme of religion and culture, as well as be confirmed in our view of his woeful ignorance on some matters of fact. Arnold is using the word culture in the sense of what we now call high culture, the arts and learning. He defines it as the best that has been thought and said in the world, and Oxford is its marker. Culture is the study of perfection. It concerns the pursuit of sweetness and light, or beauty and intellect, understanding the life of the mind to be a scientific passion to see things as they really are. All this Arnold summarizes under the label of Hellenism, as distinct from the Hebraism, to which we will come in a moment. In modern usage, the term culture may now carry the anthropological sense of the whole way of life of a people, such as when we talk of British culture or American culture. Culture can cover baseball, Kentucky Fried Chicken, TV soap operas, even going to church, a whole lifestyle, everything people typically do. More precisely, culture may be used to focus on the meaning dimension of these social practices, referring to the beliefs, norms, worldviews, and values held by a particular people. But as Raymond Williams rightly pointed out in his formative studies of culture, a conjunction is always needed between the older and the newer senses, and in this paper I shall myself be keeping both in mind. Now, with his passion for the best, Arnold launches an attack on nonconformists, and so on Baptists, for at least two discernible reasons. First, he finds nonconformist religion to excel in its single-minded pursuit of moral perfection, while ignoring the other perfections which are to be found in culture. In his view, this makes dissenters narrow, parochial, and mean-spirited. They are experts in what he calls Hebraism, but woefully ignorant of Hellenism. And here we need to pause for a moment and get to grips with Arnold's distinction between the Hebraic and the Hellenic, between religion and culture, a distinction, by the way, that he took from the poet Heine. For Arnold, religion is the practice of right conduct, but suffused and motivated by emotion. Religion is morality touched by emotion. It is an expression of the Hebrew mind, which is concerned to walk the path of righteousness before God. Arnold isn't being negative about this. He's using the word Hebraic in a thoroughly appreciative sense. Right conduct, and so religion, is 3/4 of human life. And under conduct, he includes eating, drinking, ease, pleasure, money, the intercourse of the sexes, giving free swing to one's temper and instincts. Religion, as the pursuit of righteousness, concerns such huge areas of life. But it's only 3/4 of life. There is another quarter, which is culture or Hellenism, the pursuit of beauty and intellect, sweetness and light. Arnold sees this as drawing on all the voices of human experience, on art, science, poetry, and philosophy, where Hebraism specializes in one kind of experience only, that of righteousness. Culture is a pursuit of total human perfection. Men of culture have indeed often failed in morality, but perfection cannot be reached, he thinks, without an appreciation of sweetness and light, beauty, harmony, and intellect. Now, Arnold admits that it was necessary in the early years of the Christian era for Hebraism to triumph. It was right for human development that Hebraism should come to rule the world. Christianity conquered as an attractive development of Hebraism, replacing obedience to the letter of a law of righteousness by conformity to the image of someone, Christ, who lived out righteousness in a self-sacrificing way. It replaced a law that had become impersonal and mechanical by a dying and rising with Christ. But it isn't so obvious to Arnold that Hebraism should have overcome Hellenism at the time of the Renaissance, which is what happened, in his view, in the Reformation. The Reformation suppressed the central idea of the Renaissance, a return to see and exploring things as they really are, which means seeing them in their beauty and harmony. Especially in England, according to Arnold, Puritanism checked the movement of the Renaissance, and the Nonconformists are the successors of the Puritans. Arnold is even willing to concede that there might have been some point in the countering of Hellenism by Puritanism at the time of the Reformation. The Renaissance had a side of moral weakness, a lack of moral fibre that needed to be corrected. And moreover, nonconformity, he thinks, has challenged the domination of ecclesiastical rule over the years. But Arnold believes that the Reformation began a wrong move, and that certainly in his own day, the balance needs to be righted. There needs to be a flowering of Hellenism and culture. He finds the confusion of the present time to be the result of a suppression of a cultural movement in which human beings are exploring themselves and their world with a playfulness of thought. The time has come for a new spontaneity of consciousness. But in the face of this, the nonconformists are insisting on mere strictness of conscience. The result is muddle. The Hebraic must open itself up to the Hellenic, to enlarge its whole view of the world. Room must be given for new discoveries in science, new forms of expression in the arts. Arnold's poem, Dover Beach, presents a gloomy picture of the crisis of the present time, when it seems that armies are fighting by night, blind in the darkness, not being able to identify who their friends or their enemies are. His prose writing, especially in his book Culture and Anarchy, is more hopeful. If Christianity is to survive in the modern world, it must count culture as its friend. To treat it as an enemy is to prevent a necessary renewal of Hebraism by Hellenism, and the result will be that Christian faith will be simply overwhelmed in the incoming tide. Nonconformists, though Hebraic, are ironically also Philistine, in Arnold's view, despising culture. The main point he's making is that the life of Christian discipleship needs to be in contact with a wider culture than itself for its own health. Otherwise it becomes self-absorbed and self-defensive. This is a worthwhile point of which I want to take account, even though we may judge that Arnold gives an unfair and unsympathetic account of chapel life. There's a second reason that Arnold discerns for the unsettled mood of the time, and this also is a critique of nonconformity. It's what he perceives to be a spirit of doing as one likes, which is pervading society. Freedom is being worshipped as an end in itself, and the policy of free trade has become an idol without noticing that 1 in 19 of the population still lives in total poverty. Modern life has unleashed a spirit of mere self-will, a passion for giving in to the worst in oneself just because one can. In short, Arnold detects a mood of anarchy, which was symbolized by riots in Hyde Park in 1866, when the park railings were pulled down by protesters. Arnold, perhaps surprisingly, saw the nonconformist chapel as a seedbed of anarchy. Of course, he didn't regard it as a hotbed of political agitation, but he did see it as a place where the voluntary principle, the stressing of individual choice and self-will, were placed at the centre of religion as much as in politics and industry. So he dubs the Baptist preacher C.H. Spurgeon as Spurgeon the voluntarist. In his view, dissenters made a fetish of free choice about separating from the establishment and deciding which church they wanted to join. They were doing as one likes, and so the middle classes shouldn't be surprised if the masses decide to join in. In a piece of savage irony, Arnold refers to their insistence on the Englishman's right to do what he likes, march where he likes, meet where he likes, enter where he likes, hoot as he likes, threaten as he likes, smash as he likes. As far as the middle classes doing what they like, he writes, the graver self of the Philistine likes fanaticism, business and money-making. His more relaxed self, comfort and tea meetings. Many of the new owners of industry were indeed nonconformists. Like Blake, Arnold inveighs against the dark satanic mills of the mind and the cityscape, But quite unlike Blake, he associates these with nonconformist Christianity. The antidote was culture as a unified expression of humanity. Our best self, writes Arnold, that is the self perfected and disciplined through reading and thinking, is not manifold and vulgar and unstable and contentious and ever-varying, but one and noble and secure and peaceful and the same for all mankind. We have reason, I think, to be suspicious of this emphasis on one unified culture, and the modern sense of culture rightly recognises plurality and diversity. Yet Arnold has a valid concern that society should not simply be a place of the conflict of the will, a mere game of power play. In this critique, Arnold remarkably anticipates some recent Christian opposition to the liberal democratic notion that the function of the nation state is merely to provide a forum in which individuals have the freedom to follow their own self-interest in a market-driven society. Though he has no clear view about how it might be achieved, Arnold thinks that the state can be the expression of our best self and the organ of culture. I want now to respond theologically to the second of Arnold's critiques, that the free churches are based on an exercise of self-will, on a choice of individuals for faith and for the form of church they personally prefer. That is what Arnold sees as the roots of anarchy. And so we will work back to the first critique. Arnold here shows himself totally unaware of the theology of covenant that underlies nonconformist and especially Baptist ecclesiology. Baptists have not helped themselves when they've spoken of the local church merely as a voluntary association. While having an element of truth to it, since faith cannot be coerced, this leaves out the theological conviction that Christ as covenant maker has called disciples into community. Church is not based on the will of the believer, but the will of Christ. This is not anarchy, but the rule of Christ as king, alongside his other offices as prophet and priest. In sociological terms, the local congregation is indeed an intentional community. But understood as a covenant grouping, this is not just a voluntary society which people choose to join or not. The scriptural accounts of covenant making make clear that God always takes the initiative in making covenant. This means that when we make covenant with each other, when we come to an agreement with each other to live together in fellowship and mission, God is still taking the initiative. We're not just drawing together, but being drawn together. Because God has called people into covenant, we are also called into covenant with each other. At the roots of the Baptist movement was an understanding of covenant as having two dimensions, vertical and horizontal. At the time of the Reformation, stress was laid upon the church as the new covenant community, brought into being through the blood of the new covenant in the cross of Christ. That is, the vector line of the covenant was vertical between God and humanity. But in the wake of the Reformation, radical separatists in early 17th century England were beginning to use the word covenant in another sense as well, to denote the agreement that members of a congregation made between themselves. Often under the pressure of persecution, they made a church covenant in which they promised to walk together and watch over each other. It was an early Baptist, John Smythe, who made the creative theological step of linking this horizontal covenant and the vertical covenant together. And so in 1607, he defined the church as a visible community of saints, where 2, 3, or more saints join together by covenant with God and with themselves. These two dimensions of covenant, vertical and horizontal, are moreover held within a third dimension, which has been a theme of more recent theology. We may think of the covenant of grace with humanity as being based in an eternal covenant within the life of the triune God. In the way that a modern Reformed theologian, Karl Barth, puts it, the covenant which becomes visible at one moment in human history is in fact the expression of an eternal covenant, which has a twofold aspect. As the Father, in infinite love, elects the Son into eternal relationship, so he also intends that there should be a covenant with created human beings. The eternal sending forth of the Son from the Father, eternal generation, is inseparable from the sending of the Son into the world and a mission of redemptive love. We know this because the person of the eternal Son is inseparable from the human person of Jesus of Nazareth. So we may say that our covenant with God, the vertical covenant freely given in grace, is bound up with the covenant in God's own communion of life, in which God freely determines to be God. God makes covenant with God's self as Father, Son, and Spirit, and with us in the same movement of self-determination. As we share life in covenant with each other, we are participating in an eternal movement of relational love, caught into the ebb and flow of self-giving and self-receiving within the divine life. This vision of the covenant community means living in a spirit of creative tension and negotiation, sharing in the movement of God's life, which is like a dance, weaving a pattern and finding what fits in new circumstances. In the Nonconformist tradition, the local church lives in such tensions, holding together the authority of Christ, Scripture, and the church meeting, in that order, but with a need for discernment which gives rise to healthy disagreements. All members of the church are encouraged to do a kind of everyday theology, to use a term of Kathleen Tanner, in which they meet new challenges to established practices with a feel for the possibilities of Christian living, trying to see how new activities fit with the rest of what they do, say, believe, and value as disciples of Christ. An appropriate response is to be found to the needs of a particular situation, to make the best of the opportunities it affords for Christian witness and service. There is a search for consistency here, especially with Scripture. But there's also an element of playing the game as it happens, without a rigid set of rules that will sort out problems in advance. This is the difference between a contract, where conditions are set out before entering it, and a covenant, which in the words of an early separatist tradition is a walking together in ways known and to be known. Negotiations and manoeuvres over finding authority for belief and action within the covenant community call for a very large element of trust in Christ and each other. This concept of covenant at the heart of the nonconformist tradition is very different from mere voluntarism or doing as one likes. It has an aspect of that play of consciousness that Arnold is looking for. Arnold was no doubt correct to find the debasement of the covenant principle into mere self-will in religious life and in business life. And we need to hear his critique of the nonconformist middle classes of his time, and indeed ours. But I suggest that there is a foundation for the openness of the church to wider culture, that Arnold wanted, in the idea of covenant itself. The kind of negotiation and the living within productive tensions that Christians practice within the covenant can also be turned outward to other cultural contexts, because the Christian community cannot be a self-contained social group. It's a group of exiles without its own territorial location. It is bound to be influenced by the cultures in which it resides. And this isn't just an unfortunate situation to be resisted. There's a theological basis for this relation in a vision of a covenant-making God. Scripture assures us that God makes covenant with created beings beyond the confines of the chosen people. In the Old Testament, the covenant after the great flood stands as one symbol of this, where God makes an everlasting covenant with every living creature that is upon the earth. Genesis 9. Karl Barth affirms that in the face of the revelation of God's redemptive work in Christ, we must understand the eternal covenant of grace to be made with all humankind. When God elects the eternal Son, this is a covenant of love with all human sons and daughters. This doesn't mean there is no difference between the church and the rest of the world. Scripture shows us not one homogeneous covenant, but many forms of covenant made between God and human beings. Some made with the whole people, some with a small group, some with individuals, some covenants made in the royal court, some on journeys and on the wilderness wandering. To say that all human persons participate in the triune movements of God's life, which have the patterns of a covenant, is not to say that they all participate in the same way. A covenant way of life will take on a particular shape when people consciously enter the covenant relationship, and when it's sealed and constantly nourished by the practices of baptism, the Lord's Supper, and preaching. It will have a different quality when the covenant partners are rebellious and turn away from the purpose of the covenant maker. It is possible to be within the covenant and still say no to God, as Christians themselves know all too well. Here the Catholic theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar has a critical insight when he observes that there is only one place in creation where it's possible to say no to God, and that is within the glad yes of the Son to the Father. Only where a relationship and mode of speech is already set up can one say both yes and no to God, and so the human no of rebellion is a sort of twisted knot, an ugly distortion within the relationships of the Trinity. A tragic situation which is revealed by the cross of Jesus. The very freedom of the creature to say no, von Balthasar writes, is thus always freedom to act within the covenant with God. It is time, however, to return to Matthew Arnold and his analysis of the nonconformity of his time, in which we discover that he rejects this doctrine of the Trinity as a mechanical dogma. In his book, Literature and Dogma, 1873, he finds dissenting religion to be fixated on formulas and contracts, with a theology that's akin to the machinery of business and commerce. A key example here for Arnold is the very idea of righteousness, on which he finds nonconformity as an intense form of Hebraism to focus as the one thing needful. Unfortunately, in his view, Christians of his time misunderstand the meaning of righteousness in the Bible. The great insight of Hebrew religion, he thinks, is that righteousness tendeth to life, Proverbs 11:19, and that righteousness brings happiness. This he takes to mean that there is an underlying moral law of life that right conduct, when touched and suffused by emotion, will lead to a life full of satisfaction and joy. Righteousness tendeth to life. There is a dimension of righteousness, he observes, that isn't under our control or our calculation. And so the word God refers to an eternal power, not ourselves, by which we get a sense for righteousness, and from which we find the help to do what is right. God, he says, is the eternal power that makes for righteousness. When we set out along the path of right conduct, we find that we are supported and carried by, he writes, a stream of tendency by which all things seek to fulfill the law of their being. Arnold dismisses talk about God as a personal first cause, an intelligent and moral governor of the universe, as an attempt at scientific language about God. This is a pseudo-science of God, as, so he thinks, is talk about God as Trinity. These are abstract deductions, not to be found in the Bible, which simply bears witness to the power that makes for righteousness. This truth of experience has been turned into dogmas and formulas that have to be believed, what Arnold calls Aberglaube, or extra beliefs. Arnold proposes that the faith and conduct of Israel gradually became external and mechanical, fixed on laws rather than a dynamic experience of righteousness. And Jesus renews and revives the true sense that righteousness tendeth to life. For Arnold, Jesus discloses the secret that the way of righteousness is the path of the cross, a self-renunciation in which we can die to our worst self and find the true life of our best self. This is the righteousness that leads to happiness and fulfillment, and nothing could be further from doing as one likes. For this experimental truth that righteousness leads to life, Arnold significantly uses the language of covenant, which is also my concern in this paper. He thinks that people enter a kind of covenant with the eternal power that makes for righteousness. If they pursue right conduct, they will find themselves supported and helped, and will finally fulfill the inner law of their own being. This covenant of life has degenerated, Arnold suggests, into a mere contract. The language of the Reformers, the Puritans, and now the Nonconformists about a covenant in the Council of the Trinity is actually a mythical contract. It's a fairy story of three supernatural beings, one of whom, the Son, makes a contract with another, the Father, to satisfy his legal demands and to redeem the world by dying, while the third being, the Spirit, applies the effects of this contract in human lives. St. Paul's words about Christ our righteousness have therefore also been misunderstood, as Arnold sets out to show in his book St. Paul and Protestantism, 1870. Righteousness has been turned into a mechanism of justification, a kind of contract or bargain in which we plead the blood of the covenant and receive the righteousness of Christ as something imputed or reckoned to us in a legal agreement with God. In fact, Arnold says, Paul is talking about our passionate identification with the person of Jesus, our sharing in his dying to self, and so our participation in his resurrection to life. We identify with our whole being with the righteousness of Christ, and so find the motivation and power to walk the path of righteousness ourselves. As Arnold puts it, when Paul found Christ, the struggling stream of duty was suddenly reinforced by the immense tidal wave of sympathy and emotion. And to this new and potent influence, Paul gave the name of faith. But, writes Arnold, the scheme as set forth in Puritan thinking, with its covenants, conditions, bargains, and parties contractors, could have proceeded from no one but the born Anglo-Saxon man of business, British or American. Puritans and their nonconformist successors have turned feeling into a formula. Philistines in culture, they were also Philistines in religion, converting everything into the machinery of commerce and industry. Arnold's diagnosis of the secular movement of his day was that the mass of people was calling for what can be proved, and dogmas about what was going on inside the Trinity were unverifiable. His fear was that in rejecting dogma, the masses were also rejecting the Bible with its poetic expression of the way of righteousness. The hard-headed modern multitude, he thinks, would accept nothing but what was scientific, and they quickly saw that talk of a first cause and co-substantial persons in the Trinity was pseudo-scientific. Arnold's claim was that his version of religion was, in fact, scientific and verifiable. For him, religion rests on the solid foundation of our experience of the inner moral law as moral beings. Salvation through righteousness, finding the path of right conduct that leads to life, was in his view a natural truth. It could be tested out experimentally. Such a religion was open to perfection through the many voices of culture, and this was the time, thought Arnold, for Hebraism to receive new vitality through a dose of Hellenism. Now, was Arnold right in his diagnosis and remedy? Could the tide of scientific secularism be held back by replacing the old metaphysics with conformity to a moral law? Was this the best way for culture to renew religion? From the perspective of our time, we see things a little differently. In our present culture, we no longer hold Arnold's assumption that an inner moral law is something verifiable by science. We can see that his own concept of a power that makes for righteousness is unverifiable and indeed metaphysical, no less than the Christian story of the Trinity. Anyway, the mood today is not a search for verification. There is no unqualified confidence in a scientific view of the world any longer. The desire is rather for stories that make sense of the world and which convince by their power of explanation. On the other hand, Arnold is surely right to withstand any reduction of the biblical concept of covenant to a business or legal model of a contract. Where this was happening among nonconformists, he was right to identify it as Philistinism and to oppose it. But the Trinitarian story of covenant, that I sketched a little earlier, is precisely not a contract. It is not a story of a bargain concluded between three supernatural beings, but expresses a giving and receiving of love in eternal relationships. It's about three relations of love and justice, which are like a father sending out a son in mission into the world, a son responding in love and gratitude to a father, and a spirit of hope always opening up new depths in this relationship. We may, of course, also find other dimensions of gender in these three personal relations, and use at times the metaphor of a relation between a mother and a daughter. Such language is not observational, as if we could see God as an object, even in our mind's eye. It only makes sense as participatory, as a language about sharing in these relationships. We don't receive a bargain concluded by the Trinity, but participate in movements of self-sacrificing love. Here again, Arnold is right about Paul's theology, at least insofar as righteousness is sharing in dying and rising with Christ. But Arnold fails to read the Bible properly on the great theme of righteousness. At heart, this is not right conduct and inner moral law, but a matter of right relationships with each other and with God. Right conduct flows from this rightness of relationship. This is the kind of understanding of religion with which we can meet the intellectual challenge of our own age. After all, the pervasive worldview, even in the domain of science, is not one of a set of laws, but an organic relatedness at every level of nature. We are increasingly aware of connections between human beings and all other living things in our ecosystem. And at the microscopic level of the atom, there are complex interactions going on which make the subatomic world look like a molecular zoo. A concept of righteousness that is about proper relationships, expressed in the Christian image of the Trinity, seems to fit our sense of the way that the world is. We recall Arnold's great theme, there is an eternal power that makes for righteousness. We can rewrite the theme like this: there is an eternal power that makes for relationship, because it is supremely relational. Arnold's insight that there is a tendency or movement towards life in which we can be caught up and carried is right. But this is what Trinity is actually all about. Arnold's talk of a stream of tendency can only be intelligible as a movement of relation. As Arnold makes a link between religion and culture, both seeking for perfection, each necessary to the other, so we might make the link between culture and a triune God. The Christian believer lives consciously within the covenant. This means living deliberately within the story of Jesus, in the context of the story of Israel, and further still in the context of the story of the Trinity. The Trinity is the supreme meta-narrative, not the supreme bargain. The story that God goes out from God's self on mission in the openness to the future, which is the power of the Spirit. If culture is the meaning dimension of a people, then a central part is the stories that people tell, to understand themselves and their place in the world. The distinctiveness of the Christian community, living in constant and playful negotiations with other cultures, will be the story by which it lives. Christians will tell the story in different ways. They will be identified less by an authorized and strictly defined version of the story than by a concern to tell, explore, and live the story. And hints and recollections of the story will be found in all cultures, since they have some kind of covenant relation with the triune God. As I've already suggested, finite beings can and do rebel against the covenant love of God. And so society is, of course, marked by corporate sinfulness, by a competitive spirit of self-interest, by the struggle for domination of one individual or group over others, which Arnold perceived. But wherever in the world people give themselves to others or sacrifice themselves for others, these actions will match the movement in God, which is like a son going forth on mission in response to the purpose of a father. Their acts will share in the patterns of love in God, and so in them we can discern the body of Christ. Wherever there is a movement of a measure of music, or a stroke of a brush, or the blow of a chisel, or a sequence of thought in the arts or sciences which reflect God's truth and beauty, these too share in the dynamic flow of the life of God. The whole natural world responds in its own way to the creativity of God, singing God's praises by just being what it is. And this response, too, fits in with the giving of glory to the Father by the Son. Let the last word be with the poem Dover Beach. Having faced the oncoming tide and the retreat of organised religion, Arnold does not in fact turn to the certainty of moral law as in his prose works. What matters finally is relationship, as he turns to his new wife, Lucy, and exclaims, "Our love, let us be true to one another."
We have time for a conversation with Paul about this paper, so I invite you to direct your questions again. I'll just let you pick.
Okay, that's fine. Good. Let's have some interaction. Yes, thank you, Luke.
I've always been fascinated by the image, almost a poetic image, I think, of Matthew Arnold writing in the mid to late 1860s in his club in St. James's, with comparing and contrasting that to Karl Marx writing Capital in the mid to late 1860s, just a mile or two away in the British Museum. And I wonder if you can talk about some of the ways in which those two reflectors upon contemporary British life can be compared. As you've been speaking about the way in which Arnold criticizes what he sees to be nonconformists' way of turning into theological concepts aspects of contemporary commercial and business life. One thinks above all of Marx. As you were speaking, it also struck me that one could level the same criticism at Marx that you did towards Arnold, that whilst he attempts to substitute for the metaphysical speculations he sees around him a scientific view, his supposedly scientific view is in fact as speculative as the one he puts in place of the one he's criticizing. That could be said, I think, both of Marx as he speaks about the premises of the materialist conception of history and the German ideology, as it can be said, as you just did say, of Matthew Arnold. So, although there's not a question there, it seems to me that there are all kinds of surprising parallels between these two, as I say, reflectors on English life in the mid to late 1860s. Why do you think that is?
Well, I was just going to say that you've actually answered your own question with that wonderful exposition, really. And then there was a sting in the tail of saying, why do you think this is? What's fascinating about Arnold, what's fascinating about Arnold here is the way he sees the link between a theological way of thinking, turning covenant into contract, and what he sees happening in business life. It's the same mechanical, contractual, mechanistic approach, which is why he's condemning the nonconformists as Philistines. I mean, he's got a real reason behind this. As you say, one can see the same kind of link being made between theological ideas, religious ideas, and commerce in Marx. And with Marx, you have this metaphysic of an eschatology, don't you? A kind of Judaic eschatology, which is now taking over the process of history, in fact, which is a thoroughly metaphysical idea, a form of Hegelianism. So the parallel is certainly there. So as I said, perhaps a little self-defensively, I'm not a historian, but a theologian, though one obviously interested in history. So it's the paradigm here in Arnold that interests me, of a way of thinking, the challenge to integrate faith with culture, and the way one might do it. He clearly thinks it can't be done through any kind of dogma of Trinity. My argument's been that it can in fact be done that way, because in fact this is the very relational heart of life. So you can see my theological argument here. Why? Well, of course they are both deeply rooted in a religious tradition, aren't they? Both Marx and Arnold, and value that tradition. So perhaps it's inevitable. That as well, yes, yeah. But I was thinking too of the Judaic Christian tradition that lies behind this, and so naturally they're thinking in those thought forms. It's as if, their recipe for how to cope with this new challenge of their present age is going to take some of the forms of their own poetic tradition, both romantic and scriptural. In fact, the great scriptural images are going to be there. But I think it's very illuminating what you say about the parallel there, and I'd certainly like to think a lot more about that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think up on what you've both been saying, isn't there another way to look at it, that it's kind of pre-visaging the culture wars, and that what both Marx and Arnold are objecting to in one sense is the nonconformist base and the superstructure of culture that is being produced by that base. Arnold doesn't like it because it's low culture and low form, and Marx doesn't like it, of course, because it's religious. But it's really at base what they have in common is a type of culture war objection to what it is that's being produced by the nonconformists.
Yes. I mean, Arnold isn't that despising of nonconformist low culture, actually. I mean, obviously, when it's compared with Oxford, it comes off pretty badly. But he continually says things like, these ideas are not blasphemous, and they can be helpful, actually, in terms of getting to grips with the true nature of religion and indeed of culture. If only they can be enticed out of this mechanistic, business-like, contractual approach. Even the culture they have can be a way into a wider culture. I mean, he's constantly giving, I think, like this, and when we quote these single instances of Arnold against the nonconformists or against nonconformist culture, I think we miss this real sense of sympathy that's there, actually. Yeah.
Arnold believes it can be done, whereas
he
Marx
does.
thinks that
Exactly.
all religion everywhere and always is ruined by this process. Yeah, and he sees the way in which he's looking now for this infusion of Hellenism, sweetness and light into this merely business-like, mechanistic, contractual kind of religion. But of course he sees this as having happened at various points in human history as well. He sees actually the very birth of Christianity as having some infusion, as it were, of sweetness and light into what was becoming a rather rigid Hebraic view. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Yes, I guess I'd like to move the conversation in a slightly different direction.
Yeah.
Some of us who are Baptists or who have lived in various Baptist congregations, I think might see a lot of truth in Arnold's description of congregational life as doing what you will.
Yeah.
And in contrast to the very attractive picture you have painted of the idea of covenant, it seems as if Arnold, in many ways, is right. And I would suspect not only about some Baptist life, but also much evangelical churches in the U.S. in general. And answer might be this. If we look at the early English Baptists and others, there were, you might say, necessary theological roots, presuppositions that gave intelligibility to the idea of covenant. But in some of our circles, earlier you talked about the idea that, well, there's no authorized version of the story, there are alternative versions, and surely in some sense that must be the case. But I wonder if there aren't strict limits or some limits to the diversity and the necessity for some shared understanding of the Christian story in order to make sense of the idea of covenant. Otherwise, it does degenerate into doing things your own way. You want to comment?
Well, of course, this is the whole question, isn't it, of interpretation, of authority. And, of course, in the first place, one would want to say the limits are set by the story of Jesus, the gospel story of Jesus. This, as it were, is the form against which everything is measured. But then it has to be interpreted, and I think it's the best part of the nonconformist tradition to see the congregation as involved in that interpretation of the story. So it's not so much an interpretation handed down by a magisterium, some ecclesial authority, but this process of hermeneutic is going on all the time in the congregation. And I wanted to say that this is, in a sense, a playful activity. I was really picking up here Arnold's idea that there's a kind of play of consciousness which can be lost in strict conscience. I want to say within the nonconformist tradition, it's precisely that playfulness of finding together a hermeneutic. But of course, this isn't, again within the nonconformist tradition, if I may say so, this is not simply one local church alone. It is a sense of being in fellowship with other churches, and I would say in the end, with the great church. Body of Christ is not to be confined to the local community. And so when you say, well, what, as it were, draws the boundaries and the parameters, I think it is this process, precisely, of congregational hermeneutic, which is not confined to one local congregation alone, but is part of the work of the great church universal. So there's going to be diversity within the way the story is told, but I believe there's going to be an enormous amount of consistency and overlap if that process is going on. We're listening to the voices of those in the Church of Christ throughout the world, in past and present, who've reflected on the story. We're really listening to their voices. But I think there is an element of risk here, because we don't have the magisterium, as it were, to tell us what is the entirely authorized version of the story. We have each other and the presence of Christ in our midst, and I think this interaction of the gathering of the church, the presence of Christ and Scripture, allowing these to interact with each other, is part of, as it were, the genius of the nonconformist understanding of authority. So this, I think, Arnold didn't see and couldn't see because he probably was not within in that. I mean, he may be visiting schools which were largely supported by nonconformist businesses, really. It's the business side he tended to see. But he wasn't, I think, within the community and able to feel this, the reality of this. Yeah.
He has that.
A question I have, following up with the notion of the community of the nonconformist tradition and the way that we work together to make decisions. I'm curious to hear you reflect on how today singular voices, given resources with media, using the internet, how singular voices may have disproportionate
That's very true.
power with what they have to say, that can be voiced in such a way it represents nonconformist voices, but it might instead represent one individual.
Yeah.
And then that becomes a parody often
Yeah.
of what is often a more communitarian decision-making process.
No, I think that is very true. The guru approach, as it were, in which somebody in their books and tapes and videos and so on, it imposes, as it were, a whole lens of interpretation upon things. It becomes, of course, a business, doesn't it? It becomes an industry. We're back to this link really between theology and business. I mean, perhaps we can see that particularly strongly today in the popular Christian figures. Again, I'm not wanting to be over-critical about this, but I think Arnold's right that there is this link perhaps in the nonconformist tradition, because we don't have the ecclesial magisterium, between sort of business methods and business understanding and theology. And I think you can see that particularly strongly there. I do want to say, of course, there is the place for the individual prophetic voice, isn't there, which breaks into, as it were, the corporate hermeneutic of the congregation. Says, you haven't seen this, you need to listen to this. It has to be tested out, of course, by the community, but there should be this openness to hear that single prophetic voice bringing an important word for the moment. But that's rather different, I think, from the rather institutionalized business-like guru.
But,
Yeah.
but then, if I look, it's the community hermeneutic that can then discern the authenticity of the prophetic.
Indeed, absolutely.
But
Has
it
to be.
becomes the business community
Yeah.
and the ability to propagate that
Yeah.
determines the authenticity, at least from
Yes.
the prophet side
Right.
of the
Yeah.
voice that might not be authentic.
Right. That's a very interesting contrast. Yes.
A person
See, Arnold's really onto something here, I think, that we need to listen to, really. The business of theology. Yeah.
Does Arnold criticise C.H. Spurgeon because he's also a kind of representative of an older federal Calvinism, which sets up this view of contract God, a covenant of redemption rather than a covenant of grace, and so there's a theological issue.
Yes, Spurgeon's within his target site for several reasons. One is, as you say, he in fact he refers to him explicitly in St. Paul and Protestantism as a representative of this kind of contractual imputed righteousness idea. Yes, the kind of federal theology. So he certainly identifies him in that way, which shows that he's got Arnold's got some theological sensitivity here. Of course, he also opposes Spurgeon because Spurgeon was a very prominent attacker of the establishment. And for Arnold, the establishment of the church is a way of getting into the mainstream of the life of the country. It is to align yourself with the best within the culture of the country. And if you cut yourself off from that, you become narrow and parochial and sectarian. Arnold actually wanted a very flexible view of establishment. He thought it would be possible to have an established church with room in it for a church that was non-episcopal and wasn't using the prayer book. I mean, he didn't see why we shouldn't have such a diverse national church. Of course, he convinced no one about this, I think, either from the Anglican side or from the Nonconformist side. But what he was concerned about was becoming part of the mainstream of the culture of the life of the country, and therefore this willful cutting oneself off, he reacted badly against. And of course, one issue of the time was the disestablishment of the church in Ireland. And Spurgeon had written a letter to the Times saying that he would rather all the money from disestablishment went to the state than that one penny of it should go to the Roman Catholic Church. And Arnold had the view, as one or two did at the time, that the best thing to do would be to distribute what was Anglican property among the main denominations in Ireland. Some of it should go to the Roman Catholic Church, some to the Presbyterians, some to the Anglicans. This is the way he thought of winning the hearts and minds of the Irish. And so he found this deeply irrational behaviour on Spurgeon's part. And he didn't like the fact that Spurgeon quoted the text, "My kingdom is not of this world," as an attack on the establishment. He said, well, this is Jesus talking about the inner nature of righteousness and faith, and isn't about an opposition to any kind of institutionalizing of faith. After all, he says, the Nonconformists have their denominations, and indeed their interdenominational societies. They create institutions. So this is irrational and inconsistent. So I think the attack on Spurgeon is twofold. One is that he is the prime example of voluntarism and anti-establishment, but also because he does represent a federal kind of theology. He didn't therefore know, I think, Spurgeon's deep immersion in the Catholic tradition of devotion, which, if you know Spurgeon's writing, you'll know that he was deeply appreciative of that whole tradition of the Catholic Church, in fact, of spiritual development, and read writers in that area. I mean, Spurgeon had a much wider understanding, really, of the Christian tradition than he's being given credit for here. Yeah.
Paul, thank you for that paper. I'm struck by the very hopeful note on which you end, because of all the emotions that I have on reading Dover Beach. Hopeful, love, let us be true to, is not one of them. And given that in Culture and Anarchy, Arnold describes himself as a Philistine. I mean,
son of the Philistines. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Obviously, the connection to barbarism doesn't affect the nonconformists because there were no nonconformist
Exactly. Aristocrats. Yeah.
Classes. But could you say a little bit more about this sort of hopeful note in relationships? Because it just seems to me that there's a despairing character here, even amidst Culture and Anarchy, and certainly in the poem, that we have to turn to each other because there is absolutely nothing else that's going to.
It is extraordinary, the contrast of tone between the poetry and the prose works of Arnold, isn't it? Because most of the poetry is gloomy like this. It is despairing. It is the tide going out. Perhaps it lends itself to the kind of poetry that he writes, whereas the prose works are sort of chipper. You know, they have this bouncy quality to them of a real confidence that something can be done with the situation. They're also very witty. I mean, those of you who've read Arnold know this. I mean, they're a delight to read. They are so humorous. Quite often it's scathing irony, but there's this sort of upbeat quality about the prose works, where he's setting out a kind of program in which religion and culture can really come together and can overcome this tide of secularism, in fact. We had some papers yesterday about the way that people impose a replacement theory on Arnold, as if he wants to replace religion entirely with poetry, and that is not the case. You know, of course, he thinks that religion is poetic, but he doesn't simply want to replace one with the other. There is this power, this transcendent power that makes a righteousness. So there is this curious difference of tone, and perhaps it's because there is this positive, upbeat approach to the future in the prose works that I tended perhaps to read this into, sort of eisegesis, into Dover Beach, in the turning to each other in relationship. It could simply be a despairing, well, there's nothing else. Let's just console ourselves with each other in this face of the retreat of religion. Yes. Yes, it does finish, of course, with that confusion of people not knowing who their friends and enemies are in the midst of the battle. But I still think that there's something ambiguous about that turning to each other. There is a sense of hope there that actually in this relationship something can be constructed. And I wanted to say, well, actually that really is at the heart of what actually the doctrine of the Trinity is all about, which Arnold only saw in its mechanistic, contractual form. Yeah. But I take the implied criticism that that I may have been myself too hopeful in finding that in Dover Beach. Yeah.
No, it's a good encouragement to go back and think about these things. I sort of figured there was no hope for Arnold, so maybe.
Yeah. Well, there certainly is in the prose works, but there is in the poetry. Yeah. Yes. Thank you.
A follow-up to Scott's question, and I guess my question for you is, if you see the close of the poem as something about which we could be hopeful, why is that so in light of the problem that we're talking about, Arnold has addressed, identified, and that's individualism gone awry?
Yeah.
What is it about his turning to his wife and say, well, we've got each other, that is sufficient to ground a kind of hopefulness?
Well, because
in Arnold or in your view, because part of what I see in our own culture is we think, well, everything can be solved by love, but that's typically reduced to a kind of romantic love that needn't be expressed in marriage, but temporary relationships. So, why is it that you think that this this particular incident could be regarded as having something hopeful.
Well, it's because Arnold does have a metaphysic, you see. I think this is one that I think is, I wanted to say, is actually very insightful. That is, that there is a reality which carries us. I mean, you get the same sort of idea in D.H. Lawrence, actually, the sense that there is something that carries one in the stream of life. So, though Arnold is often condemned for merely speaking about a moral law, it isn't the legalism he's looking for. It's a kind of structure of human life. It's a tendency within human life that is supported by something not ourselves. You know, God is the power, not ourselves, that makes for righteousness. So there's something already there, preveniently. We don't have to manufacture for ourselves. There is this stream of tendency that makes for righteousness and life. This seems to me to be very close to the heart of the Christian vision, and particularly the doctrine of the Trinity, that we are in fact carried by a relatedness that is already there. So that's why he's hopeful. It's because he actually has a metaphysic of a power, which is why it's quite wrong to see him simply as an agnostic. Well, he's highly religious, but it's a certain form of religion. Now, perhaps, again, I've taken, I've read too much into a couple of lines in Dover Beach here. I really wanted to set that in the wider context of Arnold's thought. I don't necessarily think he had all that in mind, especially in 1851 when he was writing it. Though it's interesting, it wasn't actually published until shortly before his book on Anarchy and Culture and Anarchy came out, 1867. That's when it actually saw the light of day. So it's much closer. I mean, all the works I've quoted have been within 5 years of each other. Culture and Anarchy, St. Paul and Protestantism, and Literature and Dogma. And the poem actually came out just about the same time, though he'd written it a lot earlier. So perhaps by then, in his own mind, he was able to put that relationship into a broader context of hope. Perhaps the text itself expanded in meaning for him at that stage. But why is there hope, and why should we have hope? I think it's because there is a reality which is there before us. We understand this reality from from a stronger Christian tradition as being personal and relational, whereas for Arnold, that seemed to him to descend into mechanism and contract. But I think there is a real insight here that there is something that carries us. And he got this from Scripture, of course. I mean, he got it because he loved the Bible. Yeah.
There is much changed about Oxford. I'm curious how you would reflect insofar as there is a way of thinking about his context in the 1870s. And perhaps more despair at times than hope. Not only about the present, but about the future.
Right.
If you suppose, if we were to engage in a thought experiment, Matthew Arnold would say about an Oxford in which nonconformists are freely admitted, in which you have long represented a nonconformist college, is this the transformation? Is there a hopefulness here that the anarchists have in fact become cultured, or is this the intrusion of the anarchists into this question and touching on culture?
And someone mentioned, I think it was Scott, that he refers himself as a son of a Philistine. In other words, he thinks that within, he divides the social classes of Britain into three. There are the barbarians, or the aristocrats, the landed gentry. There are the Philistines, or the middle classes. Then there are the people, or the masses. He thinks with each of these classes it's possible to be awakened by sweetness and light. And he obviously regards himself as one from the Philistines who has been so awakened. And his hope is that that will spread. And in fact, this will become pervasive and even universal. So he would be delighted, I think, to find nonconformists in Oxford. I mean, he says in Culture and Anarchy, let's open the universities. I mean, he was for the Abolition of the Universities Act, which, some of you know, prevented nonconformists going to Oxford and Cambridge until the 1870s. It was shortly after he wrote Culture and Anarchy that it became possible for nonconformists to go to Oxford and Cambridge. And I should mention, by the way, when we think about sort of the contraindications about lack of culture among the nonconformists, that it was nonconformists who played perhaps the strongest role in creating the University of London, an alliance between nonconformist Jews and free thinkers, of whom the nonconformists were actually the most powerful part. They had some experience of education. They had their own educational institutions. And my own college, Regent's Park College, was involved in that creation of the University of London. So, and he knew, of course, about London University. He didn't seem to know about nonconformist engagement within it. But I think he would see nonconformists at Oxford, I think, as being precisely, I hope he would anyway, this renewal of Philistinism, yes, which he saw in himself, son of a Philistine, but awakened by sweetness and light. Yeah. Yes, sir.
How far would you think that Matthew Arnold was influenced by his father, Thomas, to whom
Yeah.
he referred? I'm thinking especially of Thomas Arnold's book of 1833, arguing for the abolition of Anglican tests to
Yeah.
bring nonconformists into the established church, which you might think was an expression of sympathy for nonconformity, but in fact was a desire to abolish their separate existence, to create a national common culture. I think I hear strong echoes
Yeah.
of that in Matthew.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, this view, more flexible view of the establishment, which actually one hears now today. I mean, Anglican voices today are much stronger on this notion of expanding the establishment, making it a more flexible concept, not so regulated by law and Parliament and so on. And I think this was certainly begun by Thomas Arnold and others, and I think that's absolutely right, that this is what Matthew Arnold picks up.
I heard that in Thomas Arnold described as a totalitarian concept. Do you see totalitarianism in that?
Well, I did mention in passing that Arnold does tend to have the view of a single unified culture, and I said just in passing that actually our understanding of culture now is much more diverse, pluriform, and the picture I wanted to put forward of the Christian church in contact with other cultures outside itself was one which wasn't totalitarian in the sense of drawing everything in, but learning from each other, influence, mutual influence, but not, as it were, attempting to suck everything into one form of culture. I think there is something slightly worrying about this view of everything one and the same and unified, and there is that danger always in establishment, isn't there? But, I mean, you're the historian of the period, so you may have I'm sure you have a better view on this. Matthew Arnold really has no idea, I think, about how the state could become, with the establishment, state and established church together, become this guardian of culture and the organ of one's best self. I mean, there are some specific things he wants, like monitoring standards in education and having state examinations for education so that everyone has the same opportunity to grow and develop. That's a clear policy, I think, the idea of a state education system. But other than that, I don't find much in Arnold of a sort of practical outworking. And unless you have got some practical vision, there is always the danger to totalitarianism, isn't there? Yeah. So, kind of Barry first, do you think, and then back to Luke?
Yeah,
That'd be great.
There's
Yeah.
two things, and this would change the conversation substantially, so we may not want to go too far. The first is the implication of law and connecting it almost immediately to contract, business, to mechanism. Every time I hear that, I'm always worried of a kind of supersessionist and anti-Semitic strain in these European papers. You know, the Jew is the unacceptable other that permeates society, and Protestantism bears a big part of that. And the other was just that when it just remind, his contesting with the nonconformist, at least has echoes of the controversy between Milton and Hobbes, in a certain sense, on how one views national life and the life of the church. The Hobbes wanted a national culture, national church, national.
Yeah.
You know, once it's established, everyone conforms.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually one of the nonconformist reactions to Matthew Arnold, one of the most thoughtful ones was in The Nonconformist by the editor, Edward Mile, or founder of it, who'd been an MP as well in Bradford, makes the point that why is Arnold on the side of those who've oppressed everyone? You know, that in fact nonconformists are victims, that they have been excluded by the totalitarian, as it were, concept of establishment. And yet here is Arnold, who in fact appears to be siding with the oppressors against the oppressed, and doesn't seem to see the dangers here in an establishment which is simply imposing conformity. I think to come back to your earlier point, I said in passing that he's really very appreciative of Hebraism. You know, I don't detect an anti-Semitism here, or even a supersessionism, because he sees Hebraism actually as renewing itself from inside in the person of Jesus. You know, this is in fact Hebrew of the Hebrews, who is recapturing some of the earlier vitality of Hebraic thinking, rather than replacing it with something else. And actually, Arnold isn't against law, it's against a mechanical version of law, because he sees law as being something structural, something which is about the way human life works. So he's actually very appreciative of Hebrew religion, and indeed the legal aspect of it, but he sees the dangers of it becoming legalistic, as it were. But it has the power to renew itself really from within in Jesus. So I do think it's quite fair to see him really as a supersessionist here. He does think that Paul's great insights were influenced by Hellenism. So in that sense, there's a kind of outside influence here.
I'm going to call time on us, and join me again in expressing our gratitude.